Hello and welcome to the Answered Podcast. My name is Pavel Burza and I am a Senior Communication Manager here at CD Projekt Red. And I have my fellow host.
And my name is Sebastian Kalemba and I'm Game Director for Polaris Project.
And today we are venturing into the world of quests. And it's going to be epic because we have two awesome personalities from the studio. Who do we have today?
Man, we're having quest designers that work in this company for over a decade.
Wow.
One of them, Filip Weber, is a narrative director for Polaris Project. And second is Błażej Augustynek, who is a lead quest designer for Polaris Project. So, let's start.
Let's go. All right, guys, welcome to the studio. Awesome to have you here. And we're going to talk about quests all day, all the time. Quests, and it's a big one to unpack. And we'll start with something very general, very big. And what's special about quests in CDPR?
Do you want to take that? Or...
Sure.
I know the answer to that.
Well, I think there's probably many answers, but I think a simple one for me is that at the same time, there's not very strict rules or templates, but then we have a very high quality bar. Mm-hmm. So basically, we give you as a designer a lot of freedom to come up with stuff, but it also means that as a player, you can expect a lot out of it. And often you do not necessarily already know what's gonna come, but then we have such a high quality bar that kind of our rules are less about what kind of content needs to be in a quest and more about rules of storytelling, rules of pacing. So we really get into okay, if we have a big character in a quest, then that character having a proper arc, that's a requirement.
Yeah.
Since we make non-linear games, at least we try, when we have a story, proper choices are a requirement. And then, of course, that quality bar goes more and more into detail because then we have overall rules of what makes a good choice, because they should usually be in a moral gray zone. They shouldn't be too easy. You should have information to go on. So I think the simple answer is what I said at the start, very high quality bar, but then lots of freedom to actually go for something meaningful. But then we have so many small ones. But I think in a single word, I would still say that I think when we make quests, we see I know that's going to sound pretentious, but we see the art first. So we kind of always try to, let's do something meaningful or at least do something interesting. And sometimes there's a small quest that's just a joke, but then at least let's make it interesting. We'd never want to just make a quest to fill content.
Yeah.
It's always
For the purpose
always
of
interesting.
doing a quest. Yeah.
Exactly.
I've been thinking about this a lot because sometimes you do something and you just go through the motions. You don't really stop and think.
Yeah.
I think there's like two main things that happen. One is the approach that we have, and the other one is the process that we have. The approach is that we're basically trying to tell stories. We're not looking for pretexts for the players to do something. We're trying to tell them a story. So this is what you were saying, right? We're just using all the tools of storytelling that you know from movies and books and old media, so to speak, but also incorporate them into new media, which have their own challenges. And for example, an open world, right, is kind of a challenging environment to put a linear story in. And you don't want your story to be linear as well, right? For the most part, sometimes it's okay, right? And that also has its challenges. But our approach is that we treat each quest as a story, and I think that informs everything else we do afterwards. The other thing I was saying is the process, which is, I think it's kind of specific to how we work here. We work iteratively. So, we put something down on paper, the general theme, vibe. Maybe we talk about the dramatic questions, stuff like this. What kind of story do we want to tell about what is the general environment that we're exploring? Then we write a sort of paper design, which we iterate on again and again and again. And then once we're done on paper, then we move on to the engine. But then it's a sketch, it's a draft, and we iterate on that a lot. So I think one of the things that is surprising to a lot of people, maybe outside the industry, but I think inside the industry as well, is that it's not like you implement something and then it's done, right? And you never go back to it. You just keep working on it for basically the whole duration of the development process. So yeah, I think that also kind of informs the quality that Philip was talking about.
Well, and maybe one last thing, because it's always, of course, easy. It's quests, and then there's quest designers. But I think the truth is also one thing that makes it good is that so many people have a huge stake in there. That when we start a quest, it used to be that it's more on quest designers and writers. Now we also, from the start, as an example, want to have our cinematic design team really integrated in there. Exactly, the Three Musketeer teams. So we actually do this really together. So all of these different things that go into a quest really make the highest quality. But one super important thing is also, and that's, of course, as a quest designer, sometimes something that can be annoying to you. But as an example, that was for me when I learned during The Witcher 3, super important. That as an example, your lead quest designer, the lead writer, or the game director, they actually play your content a lot. And their reviews, their feedback also changes your quest a lot. Sometimes in ways you might not, immediately understand, but you do not necessarily have the big outlook. So I had that moment many times where, in retrospect, I can say I guess that was for the better, even if I didn't think it that way. But that is also a really important part of that process, just that it's not a single person's game. It's just all of these people coming together.
And actually, this is really interesting because I think Błażej said something pretty interesting recently, and you actually, and you actually kind of repeated it with your own words. That in the end of the day, there is a player, and good design is not a monologue, but is a dialogue with the player. And this is tricky, right? Because it is really tough because generally you said about the pace, you said about the quality. You can have all kind of storytelling tools incorporated into the quest, but in the end of the day, if this is linear and if let's say there is no choice in the end, you don't have actually this dialogue with the player. Can you elaborate a little bit more about this? What do you mean by having a dialogue with the player?
Yeah, because if you look at it like linear storytelling, so generally all the media, but there are exceptions, very specific ones, but let's not go into that. They are just monologue, which is a person is telling you a story, and you as a viewer or reader, you don't really have any...
You're digesting, right?
No, you don't have engagement.
You're just taking it in, right?
Yeah.
It's really like, but maybe to make it a little bit more concrete, it's really visible when you watch a horror movie, right? Because when you watch a horror movie, you can sort of close off, right? And just the thing just keeps going, right? And if you can't take it, you just stop interacting with it, but it just keeps going, right? So it's like someone's talking at you, right? In a game, though, it's a little bit different because you are expected to interact and overcome the obstacles on your own, right? So in a book or in a movie, you see a person overcoming these obstacles, whether they be internal or external, and you just witness it. You can have a judgment of what's going on. Sometimes the judgment is also forced on you, but in general, you're just watching and judging, right? In a game, you're the one who's actually doing the overcoming often, right? Even if it's a linear game, right? And again, in a horror game, if the monster is chasing you and you're pulling on the door and the door isn't opening, you have to be the one opening the door and you have to be making the decision: do I push or do I pull? And if I do it wrong, then I'll just die and we'll restart until you get it down and until you figure it out. So basically what the developer is doing is asking the player questions like, this is a situation, there's a guy who's a werewolf, right? A quest from The Witcher 3, which I'm playing right now again. And he doesn't want to hurt anyone, so he goes into a cave to kind of go through this process. But then there's a woman who brings her sister there because she loves the guy. So she brings the sister to him because she wanted her to see him as a werewolf. So she stops loving him and so she can get with him, right? The effect is that the guy kills his wife. He doesn't like it. And then you are presented with this situation and judge it, right? Who do you judge? How do you judge them? Make a call, right? That's on the narrative level, but also on the gameplay level. Like you can have, you're presented with challenges, right? And then you're given tools, and you use those tools to overcome those challenges. Depending on what that is, you have smaller, bigger degrees of freedom. And it's kind of up to you to overcome this. So it's very different in general, and I think it's more similar to the structure and back and forth of a dialogue. While you can also have a monologue where you just presented stuff and you take it in.
Should there be like a little bit of both? Like, should there be things which are kind of like telling everything as it is on face value, and things that you leave kind of to the player to interpret, so to have a good mixture?
But I think that's actually one of the things that is special about our games, which is we don't go to either extreme. We don't do the full linear storytelling where we tell you everything we want to, but we also do not give you all the freedom, right? We don't give you the freedom to make whatever choice you do, because in our games, you're still role-playing a character. And not your role-playing any sort of different characters. We do give you freedom, and we give you a certain range you can move in. But at the same time, for us, it's still important to tell particular stories that actually do have an arc, that do have a certain... As an example, in The Witcher, it's the typical Sapkowski short stories thing, where there is a certain moral or where there is a certain thing that we want to subvert. And that is still a story we want to tell. And within that story, we want to give you choice, and we want to give you full consequences. But as an example, we see our balance in a way that we give you choice insofar as we still are able to tell also that story.
So within some limitations, some
exactly within a certain framework.
But I want to say that you can, because these are like approaches that you can use even within one story. You can use both, and there are places where linear storytelling is more. Appropriate to use, and there are places where the open stuff is more appropriate to use. So I'll give you an example. Again, exposition, right? The intro of a quest, right? Usually you don't want to give the player choices there
because you're setting the base.
Up the scene, with the motivations, the characters, the conflicts, the genre, whatever you want. You have to be brief, because you have some time to work with, and then the player's patience runs out, right? And it's the same thing for movies. I think in movies it's like 30 to 45 minutes, and after that you have to have everything set up. Otherwise, the film feels, and I come from film theory background, so I usually go back to that when I have doubts. I lost my train of thought. Remind me what I was saying.
The amount of time you have to set up.
Yes. You have the amount of time that you're allotted as a developer to sort of set up the scene. And if you don't do that within that time frame, it feels like the film is meandering. And what am I even watching? Like, what is the character working towards? Who am I supposed to root for? Right? Yeah. But it's the same thing in games, and that's what the place. I'll just finish my sentence. Sorry, that's the place. Sorry, because I got excited. That's why I lost my train of thought. So that's the moment where you probably don't want to give the player too much freedom. I know this sounds bad, but it is for a good cause, because they need to understand what they're choosing from. They need to understand the context, the stakes, everything, right?
That's super cool, because I was actually aiming for it, because let's blend into the quest designer role, right? And like as a discipline even in the whole structure, because we've started with this having a dialogue with the player, right? But you set the rules. Yeah, you said actually genre. You like, and this is cool because you actually need to frame the player to have a dialogue on your terms, instead of having like free for all, whatever. Because then you lose the theme, you lose the conflict, you lose the. You should simply care about what's going on in the quest, and this setup needs to be kind of provided in a way that nobody knows about it, but people want to play on your terms, and that's the dialogue when it's happening, right?
So we choose the topic of conversation.
Yeah, exactly.
We need to do it well because it needs to fit the overall theme of the game.
And the player defines where they want to take that conversation, pretty much. But it's also within some framework, like you said, that we need to keep it in.
But that's also actually where one thing is really important, where we shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking like, but this branch of the quest is the one that I actually want to tell. That's the best story. So, I'm giving the other branches because, well, it's non-linearity.
And then you have Cyberpunk, where you feel like none of the decisions that you make are good, and that you're kind of, it's in between. Like I also wanted to interject before, because you said that, we kind of, when it comes to the RPGs that we do, we kind of are kind of, there is also like a ramification in terms of things that we can do. But I feel like Cyberpunk kind of broke that a little bit, because you're building your own character there, and it's much different than The Witcher, where you have Geralt as the main protagonist. Here you have V, who can be pretty much like, it's only defined into like three, like, street kid, corpo, or nomad, right? But but it can also branch out, and you can make your character whatever you want. So I feel like there's more options coming from here, but to a certain extent.
No, because I was thinking about it, and I think V is a pretty defined character at the end of the day, right? Even male and female V, to me at least personally, like, we set out to do. I guess a more open character, what you're talking about, and it's not defined. The character is not defined. The characters, because really there's like two, I think. They're not defined to the extent that Geralt is, right?
Yeah.
But they do have some. They have their own voice, and I think a lot of this comes down to the writing and the way that they're being acted. And funny story, when we were working on Cyberpunk, we made the conscious decision that quest designers are going to think of V as a female character, while the writers think of V as a male character, right?
Okay.
So we didn't want to have any kind of, gaze and, be it female gaze or male gaze and, approach to the world. So we did this, and to me personally, like, V is always a woman. When I see male
That's
V,
interesting.
it's kind of like I mean, it's cool, but it's not the real V.
Yeah.
It was a real conscious choice
To me personally.
Yeah, because we were used to Geralt. We were always used to writing for Geralt, making quests for Geralt. So when we knew, okay, we're making a new character, and that character can also be a woman, we just made it a rule when we wrote our quest design documents to always write she. Just so we remind ourselves in our brain that this is a different kind of character, where now we actually have to consider more than maybe with Geralt.
Yeah.
And I do think there are things, as an example, with, as you said, with the life paths, that this kind of gives you a promise of being able to play more different kinds of characters. I think this is a thing where, in the future, that's, as an example, something we would like to improve. Since I do think we gave a promise there that maybe in the end we did not really sell, where the game begins with this very specific thing. You can be a nomad, a corpo, a street kid, but then it sometimes goes away a little bit. We move it all together. Then sometimes you can do it.
You can branch out to different things.
Exactly,
also.
But I think it's something where, as a quest designer, I think in retrospect we can see that the old
so
topic,
making it more meaningful in the sense of what you choose, you can actually pursue that
the
path
old topic,
more.
given more experience, given more time, I think maybe we would make it a bit less muddled than we did it there. Because as an example with Geralt, once Witcher 3 was made, a lot of people in the studio already had made games with Geralt a few times. And as an example, some like myself, who only worked on Witcher Wild Hunt, they didn't work on Witcher 1 or 2, I still had played those games. So it did feel natural to, okay, I kind of have a feeling for how Geralt could make choices, right? What's his range of choices? It felt kind of natural. And for Cyberpunk, we had to learn that again from scratch, essentially. And I think there were growing pains, but that's also, I think, part of the fun as a designer.
I think with the life paths, it's the life that you live as V, right? So whatever you used to do before, there's a clear moment where it all crumbles, right? And you start a new life with Jackie, and and so this is.
But you have the foundation in the back of your head.
Yes,
Also,
yes.
depending on, you know, the choices that you can say, how you can reply to people. If you're a street kid, it's very specific to your background there. Yeah, but sorry to cut you off.
Yeah, no, sure. I mean, obviously, we would like it to matter more, right? But I think the way it plays out right now, it's like you come from a certain kind of life, right? And that life has ended. It's in the past, and now you're living this new life, which ends. Spoiler in the prologue, and then you have to deal with the consequences of that. Which,
Yeah, it also kind of tells you about Cyberpunk and Night City and everything that happened in the game as a genre, like what you can expect, because the outcomes they're never like jolly good and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean because the way and there's like people essays on YouTube that I listen to, and people get it right that the initial motivation for V is I think very close to the motivation of a lot of people, right? It's just power, money, right?
Yes.
Stuff like this,
Making it.
respect, you know, all that stuff. And it's I remember doing this comparison once when we kind of nailed down the basic premise of the story, that it's very similar to Pokemon and Ash.
I want to be the very best.
Because he wants to be the very best, right? And this is, in this world especially, this is a very childish dream.
Yeah.
And it gets confronted with this brutal reality of the world. And there's tons of people like you in this world. And you are faced with, the brutal reality of this childish dream. It ends in everyone you know and you cared about dying, basically, yourself included, right? And then you sort of have to pick up the pieces in the story. And then you meet a person who's done kind of the same things, right, Johnny?
Yeah.
And ostracized the people or sacrificed the people that they love, that they should be caring about, because that's kind of important, right? And this is my personal interpretation of the story, and this is because, I've been working on the Nomads so long, which is kind of like a counterweight to what's happening in the city, right?
Yeah.
The values
I love the Nomad path, because you're kind of away from the chaos.
Yeah.
In a way.
Yeah.
In a way.
For these people, for the Nomads, the important things are each other, right?
Yes, I
and
love
in the
that.
city, you kind of sacrifice Jackie and T-Bug and pretty much everyone else to chase this dream, this childish dream that you have. And Dex does the same to you, right? So I don't know. I think it's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's
I don't have a point.
and I'm really happy that also that this kind of bled into Edge Runners, because it shows you the same thing. Like people, like there's no happy ending. It's very noir. It's very dark. Well, I feel like there was more happy endings and positive outcomes in The Witcher. Like it was.
Yeah, but the common thing between, let's say, Edge Runners and V, doesn't matter if it's female or male or whatever whatever your path is that you don't want to be a cog into the corpo machine. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And actually, that makes you defined from the get-go, and this is a very strong motivation, as also Błażej mentioned, right? And so we kind of set it up like you kind of like a container, but actually you are defined more or less just to make sure that the motivation is going to be strong, right? And I would like to get back to the quest role.
Because we diverted somewhere else.
We a little bit derailed, which was really fun and cool. But guys, could you please elaborate, like, how does it really look, and who's like quest designer like in the structure? Because for me personally, it's like a small director that directs the quest and stuff, takes care, like connects all the dots and all this kind of stuff, right? But tell us please and explain it in your own words.
I mean, it's tricky because basically what you say, I would say, is right in some sense, that you are the person in the middle. In the end of the day, as a quest designer, you are responsible for that thing, which is the quest coming together in the end. And often not always, sometimes we switch around, but often you're there from the inception. You might write that initial pitch to the final thing. And you're supposed to be the constant that makes sure that all of these different parts that need to go in a quest come together. And that's your responsibility as a quest designer. The tricky thing with calling us director is also that this is a trap for quest designers, where often, well, I wouldn't say actually often, but rarely that can also happen, that this can get to some people's heads, that they feel like, well, you other people working on a quest, I'm telling you what to do, right? I'm the boss, but that's also not true. You're the person in the middle that is really making sure to facilitate all of that. But what your actual job is to make sure that all of these people can do the best job possible in their regard. So this all comes together. You're not supposed to be their boss, because they have bosses of their own that make sure that the quality is really there. So I think
you give them the context, they make the calls, right? But I think because the way I organize it. Sorry, you were saying I cut you off.
Well, no, exactly this. But at the end of the day, you're also just a jack of all trades, right?
Exactly. This is what
Exactly, that's what we wanted to
One
get
man's
to. We
band
even
kind
have
of,
that in the
you know what I
notes.
mean?
Like,
So it's really hard to find because the way I structure it in my head is when grandma asks, for example, right? It's kind of hard to explain.
What do you do?
What do you do daily? Like you come to the office and what is exactly that you do, right? So the way I structure it in my head is there's 3 pillars to what we do. One is being the ideas person, and a lot of people misunderstand this, that's all there is. It's absolutely not that all there is.
I have
the
an idea
smallest
for
part
a
of the
quest,
job.
and you guys just do it.
It's super important.
And you tell me that your grandma is buying this.
No, I mean this is a bit a bigger explanation than the grandma's explanation.
But it's a really important one, because idea guy is what a lot of people aspire to be.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
that job doesn't exist.
Yeah.
No one needs an
Yeah.
idea guy.
No.
It's a very small part.
I mean, maybe if you're like a narrative director or whatever, I don't know, Philip, is that?
Well, I wouldn't like to see my role as being the
I
guy
don't
that
think
gives
it
everyone
is.
else ideas.
I have an idea. You implement it.
Yeah.
It's
I'll
not-
judge it.
It's absolutely not how it works.
Exactly.
So yeah, but I think there's like 3 pillars to it. The one is design or like narrative, right? And that's what we do. We're basically script writers to some extent. We don't write dialogue. That's out of our field of expertise. Though some people, as Seba said, jack of all trades. So some people gravitate towards maybe better, dialogue more or something like
or
this.
just maybe like switching and changing the dialogue
So
a little bit, or working closer with narrative to kind of adjust things so it works within the quest, right?
We do write initial, we call it debug dialogue, but like the pre-dialogue. And sometimes, it can be very general. Sometimes if a quest designer has a very specific idea, they tend to write, we call it shadow writing, which usually we're not supposed to do. Sometimes that happens. And if you're,
organic process.
exactly. And if you're really linked in with the writer and that works, great. But usually our job is to write the general idea of the dialogue, the character, the main choices that are happening. But then we actually give it to the people that are experts in that field, which are our writers.
They're pretty good. The other pillar is implementation, which is all the technical stuff. We do a lot of technical stuff, and I think
I saw those things like where you connect the stuff, and it's like it becomes like a bowl of spaghetti, almost like with all the possibilities.
box,
you get this outcome if you do this, you do get this, but if you do this, you go there, and it's like a jumble.
So there's little coding in that. There used to be more, back in the day. Right now, you can be, a good technical quest designer and not even know how to code, which to some people it's mind blowing.
Wow.
It really helps because it puts your there are people in our team who can do this, but and from my own experience, I know it really helps. To kind of structure your logic and understanding like basic programming concepts and stuff like this. So that's the second pillar, the technical implementation, and duration wise during the production process, I would say that's like probably 90%, 80%, something like this. That doesn't mean that the design phase, which kind of is really heavy at the beginning, but then goes on throughout the whole process because of this iteration that we're doing. That doesn't mean that the design is less important. It's just the foundation that you build on. and I think it's good that it's important that we also have to actually do the things that we want to do, not only talk about them or tell other people to do them, like Philip said. So that's the two pillars, and then there's the third pillar, which is the being a director, I guess, like we
bit producer
covered,
as well.
maybe kind of a producer,
Kinda
you know,
like on
just
a movie, right?
being this connecting tissue between all these disciplines. So you could say, and this is the Grandma explanation, that we are script writers, scripters / programmers, whichever probably scripters, not programmers, because programming is much more involved, and then directors. And then you say those three things. To Grandma, you should probably say programmer because it's
IT.
Yeah, IT. Yeah, easy.
And then
I work in IT.
Yeah, and then I think they get it, right?
Yeah.
And that's who we are. Am I correct in saying that, or do they think?
Yeah, no, but it's really, we're doing a little bit of everything. So that there's actually a reason why a lot of quest designers used to be modders, because often they're people used to doing all of these things, right?
Yeah.
Doing a bit of level design, doing a bit of the cinematics, because that's also one big challenge. As an example, on Cyberpunk, every quest designer had to have technical knowledge at least, not necessarily the real expertise, but the technical knowledge of a lot of these tools, of the tools that the level designers used, of the tools that the cinematic designers used. We had to make scenes too sometimes, or at least be able to fix them. And that is really a job that demands a lot of broad technical knowledge, if not necessarily the extreme deep version in all of these directions. The extreme deep one is in our quest tools.
I also always feel like a quest designer has bigger, wider visibility in terms of like the whole product, like the product as the
multiple
whole.
hats,
Yeah,
right?
so kind of knows what else everyone is kind of working on and sees the building blocks that come into, you know, telling a story and doing quests and actually having the player engage into that.
That's what I meant saying, that our main responsibility is not to tell people what to do in that third pillar, right? But to give them the context to what they're doing. Because you have a VFX artist, for example, who's doing beautiful VFX, but he or she doesn't really probably understand the full context of how this plays into the whole thing, because, you know, they have their own breadth of knowledge that they need to use, and that sort of leads to a kind of tunnel vision, right? So we're there to sort of like inform them of like how this is going to play out, and with that information, you know, Seb's coming from an animator background. I don't remember if it was you or someone from your team, but I remember telling some animator told me during Blood and Wine, it was like a, you know, teachable moment for me personally, told me, don't tell me what I should do, like tell me what do you want to say through it, right? And then I said, okay, so I'm not supposed to tell you the gestures that you're supposed to animate, just the general vibe of what you're trying to do.
That's a good question from animator, right?
I don't know who told me that, but respect.
So good acting is actually a context and a subtext, and the subtext actually very often defines the gestures.
That's a whole different podcast, though. Pretty much, you could do like a whole episode how story informs animation and all that stuff. For sure.
But that, as an example, is one of those lessons I think we learned. Why we earlier said that we have now the three musketeers that are really there from the beginning: the quest designer, writer, and cinematic designer. Because it used to be that it's mostly writer and quest designer, and then we often, as an example, produced scenes where the characters say a lot and they think a lot, but maybe they don't do a lot. And then a lot of work after the quest design already stood had to be done to actually make the scene's interesting, so the cinematic designer can actually do their job in the best way possible, direct the scene, make sure there's action. And that often happened late. And now we want to make sure that we actually have those things much more connected at the beginning.
I'm really happy you said this, because that ties in perfectly to the next question for us, which was what's the recipe for a perfect quest? And it kind of ties into this, because you have cutscenes, you have the cinematics, you have gameplay, but you also have, you know, the places where the player is fully engaged in this kind of looking through things, and kind of sometimes finding maybe, I don't know, some information through, I don't know, shards or through notes which are left or letters like in The Witcher, which kind of inform you more in terms of what's happening in the quest. But then you are moved on to, let's say, a cutscene in which, there's you see like how the characters react to what's happening, or they're informing the player in terms of like what's happening. So what's like a good recipe? What's the perfect mix in terms of a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of this, and then you have a perfect quest.
Recipe.
Or is there anything like that?
That would make our job very easy.
Yeah, because it sounds dangerously close to template, right?
Yeah, which we try to avoid here.
Yeah, I mean, you could say a bunch of like guidelines.
Yes.
But I think this is what you're asking for. But there isn't like one recipe. After an exposition, you should have some combat and then some chase and something, because that just doesn't work out if it doesn't work with the context of the story you're trying to tell.
I mean, super simply, and for me, that actually still makes sense. 10 years ago, when I started, in my first weeks, I was just asked pitch quests, just come up with quest ideas. And our lead quest designer at the time, Mateusz Tomaskiewicz, he gave me very simple rules. He said, okay, every quest that you're pitching right now, it should have a twist somewhere. It should have a moral choice. And don't forget to put gameplay in there. Nice. And, at a basic absolute core, that actually makes perfect sense, at least for that early step when you're actually coming up with an idea. Because if you're coming up with a quest idea, there should already be room for gameplay. I don't need to have a full gameplay design. But if I come up with a quest pitch that's just a really cool story, but there's not a lot for the player to do, then it's probably not a good quest pitch. If I come up with a quest pitch that's just a completely awesome linear story, but without a good choice, then that's not a good Witcher quest or a Cyberpunk quest, because we want to have those choices. So I think those simple recipes, they're good and they work. But then a lot of it is really, it really is iteration. Like we go through there. And of course, there's always exceptions.
Yeah, no, because
I see you're not a fan.
I immediately want to challenge that, because not every quest should have a twist, or not every story. Let's just use the word.
Well, let's say change instead of twist, right? Like something should change.
But if you do it this way, then you end up with the player expecting a twist or a refocus, because sometimes it's a refocusing of the problem, recontextualizing of the problem, big words, but you know what I mean. And then we end up in a situation where you're sort of detaching yourself emotionally from the story you're playing through, because you know that there will be a twist, so you're kind of waiting. Okay, but what's the punchline? What's the punchline?
But the way we're doing it is like it's a matter of like how we set up the consequence in the end, and you can do it through the twist, you can do it through the and other different, let's say, flow. But the in my opinion, like the trickiest part is as soon as we're setting up, let's say, the choices. And you say, let's say you're playing the quest, you let people play the quest, and it seems that in the end that 9 out of 10 people are choosing A. That's the trickiest part, because there's no choice.
Yeah.
And in my opinion, like that's the trickiest part. And I'm wondering, like, what do you guys think? Because to be honest, like the sweet spot is 50-50. You know what I mean? Like, or at least 6-4, and that's the sweet spot. But making, let's say, making it like everyone to care kinda evenly, it's really tricky.
Well, I think there's not a specific recipe for a choice like that, but I think the truth lies in always giving a lot of context, but then keeping the consequences surprising, right? Because your outcomes, you shouldn't already know the exact outcomes, but once the outcome happens, I need to actually have context beforehand. So when I make my choice, I can guess, okay, this could mean either this or this could mean either this. And we always have to make sure that you at least have something to go on. If it's just completely random and you're like, go A or go B, but I don't even know what those are, then it's just a completely random choice and it's not narratively terribly interesting.
Yeah, and I actually love it. Sorry,
but at the same time, if I already know what A and B will be exactly, then it's also not a good choice.
Yeah,
so it is a kind of a field in the middle, and this is something we try to get right really early. But it still happens sometimes that this, like in practice, this just doesn't work. But then that's actually where another discipline comes in that's super fucking important for us. And that's basically our narrative QA, because they're the ultimate players, right? Because I had those moments where in Quest I made huge changes because I assumed the players would feel a certain way. I assumed the players, I think they would choose this or they would choose this. But then in practice, a narrative
out
QA
totally
plays it,
different.
and they all make that same choice, and then they tell me, well, because of this, 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 and this, and I'm like, oh, okay. And because you can, of course, as a storyteller, you have a feeling for these things, right? So often you do get those things. You can try to get those things right, but you're always, your quest, all your intentions. You're not a player, and you're not unbiased. And this is why we have our narrative QA, who are basically, they're the experts and actually telling you exactly where all of these things need to come from. But at the same time, they are that player. They are trying to play this unbiased, and they can actually tell you the truth that you might not be able to see. And that's also important, I think.
It's also something that you mentioned, that kind of having someone who is not as close to the thing, because you said like whenever you're working on something, you're very close to it. And then sometimes you will not think of possible outcomes or how this can be interpreted. But then you have someone coming in from that hasn't been working like hands-on maybe on it, but is seeing it for the first time. That person's experience and the choices that they make would be totally different than the ones that you kind of envisioned in your head, right?
You know that feeling when you repeat a word so many times that it stops having any meaning. It
Yeah,
just loses
yeah,
all meaning.
yeah.
So that's kind of what happens, with every story. I wanted to say especially with horror, but really with every story. Like you play it so many times that you stop, like you just go into full tunnel vision mode. And you're thinking about, challenges, problems that you have to face, to solve, technical stuff, then talking to an animator and just yourself coming, managing to do another iteration for a deadline, all that stuff. And it's sort of, at some point you kind of lose this understanding. But there are moments. So yeah, the outside perspective is super important. And we also have safety nets because right now we are sort of on the safety net level because the leadership, the directors, etc., everyone plays those things. So it's not up to the quest designer and it ends there. It's like levels, right? But there are also cool moments that in the lifetime of a quest that really sort of refresh it for you.
Okay.
So one moment is where actual dialogue lands, like real written dialogue, not the debug dialogue, because then you're like, oh, okay, this is what how you can see it. This is how you can interpret it. It's very fresh, right? So it refreshes it for you. Another moment like this is when VOs land, because then you get the actor's interpretation of all of this stuff. Another moment is music when it lands. It's refreshing again. And
sets it up.
Yeah, it because it tells you like music sometimes it just tells you what you're supposed to feel.
Yes,
Exactly.
Yes,
exactly. So at that point, when you're faced with someone's interpretation of what you're doing, it gets refreshed in your head, and you get a new perspective on it, and it's really cool also because it starts to feel alive. And when I play Witcher 3 now, I used to work on it, but when I play it to some extent, it's like going back. Home to an old place that and all the stories and
familiar
stuff.
place.
Yeah, familiar place, exactly. But on the other hand, it almost feels to me, I don't know about you guys, but to me it feels like it's an entity of its own right now. It's grown up and went into the world, and it couldn't have been any other way. I don't know.
Yeah.
It just, I mean, of course, there's stuff that we want to correct.
Of course.
It's never finished.
Always.
We had this conversation before we started recording.
Never-ending iteration in terms of what we can do better, and it's something that defines us. I feel like as a company. Yeah.
So one follow-up actually, guys, because it seems that quest designers are like jack of all trades, as we said, one-man's band kind of, and it's probably super easy to be overwhelmed with the amount of things that quest designer hasn't played. And you said something, Błażej, that actually there are some gates in a quest lifetime that actually refresh your perspective. And there is also a feedback that comes, let's say, as Philip said, from our internal narrative QA, our players, narrative players also. But do you have anything that helps you guys to really refresh your perspective, to like just to not be overwhelmed on daily basis? Because I remember, let's say, this is the same story with animation. Like you are so quickly being, let's say, tired of what you see on screen, that there are some special, tricks that animators can do to refresh the eye. But I'm wondering, what are your tricks to refresh your eye and to not be overwhelmed, and still to make sure that the pace of the quest and the surprise in the end, I think I rather like to call it surprise rather than twist, because twist actually,
Shyamalan.
Exactly. So any advices here? Any tricks, like talking from experience?
I think prioritization. So technically, our process, if things go well, it doesn't always go well, our process helps with that. Because as an example, when you begin a quest, you're in paper design. So you're not handling all of those other people and teams. You're sitting there with the Three Musketeers. You're pitching, you're writing a quest design, you're writing story beats. And if the process works nicely, that stuff should come one after another before you actually start going in the engine. And then it still starts rather simple, because the quest designer then works first by themselves. I set up the structure myself. I put in all the things in the level. I set up the scenes. I write the very basic dialogue. And I don't already have to necessarily, as an example, think of, oh my God, what music will I have? What VFX will I have? Because that's a step later. And then, we have a...
Sometimes no.
Yeah, that's the thing. When the process actually works as it should, then you don't have to. Sometimes, unfortunately, you do. But we have those gates where after another, more and more things come in. But then when you have all the things at the same time, and when you have 250 bugs on one section of one quest, you do really just have to know your priorities. So as an example, you can really just check what's the highest priority. I'll just focus on this. Or that's what I used to do. Sometimes I just say, okay, I'll take this 5-minute stretch of the quest and I just fix everything. I fix everything, start to finish. I'm done. And then I play it. I see all the things that are still wrong. I make my notes. I fix all of them. Okay, it's finished. And now I move to the next stretch. And this is what I personally always did. You, of course, need to know when you can afford that. If you have what we call a P0 priority, so you have to fix this now. As an example, the game doesn't continue at that point. Well, you got to fix that now.
Yeah, of course.
But it helps to really focus your mind on, okay, this is what I'm going to do today.
And
then you're doing
calm
that.
you down also. Trust the process.
Yes.
Exactly. Because
Yes.
that's super cool.
There's a bunch of other tricks that you can do. Tricks, yeah. Let's call them tricks. One is, for example, jumping between types of content, right? So, I mean, between, not even types of content, what I'm saying, between quests, right? You have a bunch of different quests that you jump between. And, ideally, you'd have the luxury of just stepping away for a month, letting it boil, letting it simmer, let it cook, right? You come back and you look at it and you understand, right? But obviously you don't have that. It's with deadlines and everything. So you can do a similar thing, which is just jump between different
cool.
quests. And then you kind of forget that previously. I also do another thing. My wife has an NDA signed, so I just tell her the stories and I look at her, right? And so when I see I'm losing her, I see that, okay, this is probably the spot where we still need to work at it a little bit, or I see where she is a bit more interested, so maybe I should tap into
Pursue that more,
a little bit, and you can do the same thing with your colleagues at work, right?
Bouncing ideas off of each other. It's really cool.
Totally. Like sometimes it's we do this thing where we ask. The rubber ducky tests that programmers do, right?
Yes.
They just explain to the ducky what they're intending to do with the code. Similar thing, you ask a person to be a rubber duck, however weird that sounds. And sometimes even by talking on your own, you realize, okay, I need to look at this more or whatever. And sometimes they will tell you, sometimes you ask them to play this thing. And this is actually something that we incorporate in our process, which is peer reviews. we ask, we just switch around with the quests, someone plays your stuff and they tell you what's important to them. Also, another thing, but this is kind of post-release, but it is super, I think, valuable just watching people play online. You see what they pay attention towards. So that, for example, I have an example here. I saw a YouTuber play. I don't remember who that was. Play one of my quests. Never mind what the quest was. I'll just set up the situation. It was a negotiation, right? You were negotiating for supplies with like criminal elements in Novigrad, right? You were doing that as Geralt by proxy because the guy that you were kind of helping out, he wasn't really, too much of a negotiator, I guess.
Hattori.
Hattori.
You needed the muscle.
Yeah. So I mean, initially the plan was that he would do it, but he was kind of, not so Geralt just took over, right?
Yeah.
And you can let him talk, by the way, I think.
Yes.
I don't exactly remember. I'll replay it probably today. I saw, for me, it was just very mechanical because I knew that it was mostly like we were trying to get into that moment where you think about the negotiations or the possible consequences, but really there weren't any to that specific place. There were consequences in other places of this quest, but here we didn't want to because you had to have the deal, right, for the materials. So we just made it feel like it was important. And to me, this was just kind of clicking through because, I when I was testing the quest, I was just mashing the button and I just forgot this was a thing even, right? For the writer, this was important because he was like, weighing the pros and cons and all of that stuff. I wasn't because I was focused on something else. And then I watched that guy on YouTube play it, and he was agonizing over each and every choice, and there were like 3 of them, and he
I have the same problem.
He reached a moment where the people you were negotiating with were just leaving the scene, and Hattori was like, oh no, we have to get them back, and Geralt was no, let's keep it cool, and it felt like a Breaking Bad moment, I think. And I was completely unaware that was a thing, but back in 2015 or something, right? Right now, I pay a little bit more attention thanks to that story. So
That's cool. That's so cool.
Actually, I have a question, guys, for you. Like your favorite quest and why in CP and Witcher 3?
Yes.
Because
But you mean of generally or ones that we did?
You call the category the one that moved you, or the one that was the most entertaining, or the one
challenging to work on.
Challenging, yeah. Like it's your call.
It can be yours. It can be someone else's.
The brightest memory. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
From CP and Witcher 3.
I know it's tough because there's a lot of good stuff. Yeah,
it's hard. Yeah.
Yeah, I hate this question, and I should really be prepared for it because it comes up so often.
I mean, the last thing you said, I think I can answer because it's a very simple one, like the brightest memory.
Yeah.
And for me, that is during Blood and Wine, because it was a thick personal thing for me. I wanted to do a simple quest where the Lady of the Lake gives you back Erudite, your sword from The Witcher 1. And I was I was a huge fan of The Witcher 1.
Yeah.
I always thought like, that was so nice, that moment when you get that sword, and I still know that song that plays. I think it's called Silver Sword on the soundtrack. So awesome. And I pitched that quest. I implemented it. Later, actually, one of our quest designers, Rafał Jankowski, he actually finished that quest. One of the quest designers at that time, and I had requested music from Marcin Przybyłowicz, and I just said, "Can we have a melody from The Witcher 1?" When you get that sword back, like one of these, because I know all of these Witcher 1 songs, River of Life, all of those songs. And he made one, and it's Dusk of a Northern Kingdom. It's the song in Witcher 1. And he made a reference to that song when you get that sword. And I saw it implemented for the first time in that quest when that cutscene plays. And I actually did get a little tear in my eye. And I was like, look,
nice.
I was that huge Witcher fan, and now I'm sitting here and I got to do that little thing. And that's a small quest. It's one of the smaller quests I did. I did much huger quests, big stuff, cool stuff. But I always remember that one moment because I think that was also, back in those days, we sometimes worked late. I think it was like 9 p.m. in the office. Yeah. People were already gone, and I just sat there in darkness, and that thing played. Oh, and that was really nice.
Sounds epic.
There are moments, right, that stay with you, right, that stick with you. I remember one of the epilogues for Cyberpunk, for example. It wasn't even my quest. I was just kind of fixing bugs for it for a while, just to cover, because to answer your previous question, we always do this thing where we not always, sometimes do this thing where we switch around the quest and we work on someone else's for a moment, and then we switch around it again. We try to keep it proprietary, so to speak, so everyone can sort of have their own stories, but sometimes it's good to switch around. And this is what happened in this specific case. I got the ending where Johnny overtook V's body, and he's saying goodbye to her. The thing with Steve and the guitar, and etc. And as I was fixing those bugs, I didn't see this quest before. I didn't read about it. It was and it was an epilogue, right? So sorry about the spoilers.
I think it's fine.
But it's a moment that stuck with me because as I was fixing those bugs, I was kind of getting glimpses of this story, and then I just played. I decided, okay, I need to play this from beginning to end just to see the bugs. But also there was this thing in me that I wanted to see the story itself. And I remember I was just it just really stuck with me. I don't know. It was an emotional moment at a very unexpected moment, I guess. I was really focused on the technicalities and stuff, and then suddenly a wave of emotions hit me. So I remembered that. I don't know if I have a favorite quest.
That's actually interesting. Being emotional through fixing bugs in the quest.
Yes, yes. No, there are moments you get goosebumps because all the pieces fall into place, and you play this thing, and it comes alive, right? Yeah. And that stuff stays with you, right? So it's pretty
cool. Guys, you said previously about that a lot of quest designers were modders, right? Do you have any advices how to become a quest designer or anything?
How to start?
How to start in general, right?
Start modding.
Well, how to start is have a portfolio, basically, have something to show, because it's really great that was around when I started, but much less than it is now. You can, of course, study game design and all of these things. And one of the best things that comes out of there is actual practical experience. And this is the thing that we actually look out for. When we actually look for a quest designer, we want to see what they did before. At least if we hire someone who doesn't already work in the industry. If we, as an example, hire someone who's a senior quest designer in another company, they don't necessarily need to do a test. We will do an interview with that person. But if you want to start, I want to see something, right? And part of that is take any engine, take Unreal Engine, take Unity. Well, maybe not anymore. Sorry. But, take any engine or take a modding tool. Bethesda makes great modding tools. We did the modding tool for The Witcher 2 Red Kit. That was great.
Yes.
Take any of those, even older ones.
Play around with it.
Do something. Yeah. Do something. Can be a quest, can be a whole story. And then just show it. We had one quest designer, Eero Varendi. He made a whole remake of the prologue of The Witcher 1 in The Witcher Wild Hunt. Importantly, The Witcher Wild Hunt did not have full modding tools. So he had to use very difficult, annoying to use workarounds to even make that happen. And he put it on YouTube. And I literally just saw him through this. I saw him on the forums and I just reached out like this. So that was... and I think that's also how I actually started in the company. It's a part luck. You have to be found, of course. Someone has to see it. But also it's a lot of you just work towards it. You just do something. You put it on YouTube. You put it on Twitter. You put it on a forum. But the most important thing is that you just do it for its own sake. If you, as an example, make a project, and this is how I'm going to get hired at that company, sure, you can do it. But often... the best thing is you just do it because it's great, because you want to do it.
Passionate about it.
Exactly.
Right?
And you can feel when a project was done like that. And for me, that's often a very, very good sign for a quest designer. Because we need to, in our job, it can be very tricky. It can be very overwhelming. You do need to have methods to motivate yourself. And just having joy in making something, that's the most important thing you can have as a quest designer. And if you show that to us, and you have some expertise there, that's the best sign. And that's how we actually hired lots of quest designers, by actually them having a really awesome project.
Yeah, and the skills that you gain by modding, they're basically the same suite of skills that the pillars I mentioned about, right? So if you're doing, I don't know, I remember the first things I was doing, I think as a kid, was Warcraft 2 mods, maps, right? But they did have triggers, then StarCraft and all that stuff. And I had like a support group. We were kids back then, we were making whole campaigns and stuff.
Nice.
All of that is lost to time. I don't have it anywhere. It's I wish I could play it right now. I have like flashbacks of it, but never mind. The things that we were doing is we were basically designing it, that doing the narrative, designing the gameplay, the challenges the player was going to face, then implementing it, and then as a group we were coordinating. So 1, 2, 3, all the pillars are there. You basically have all the skills necessary. So the only difference between you and so as a modder and you as a I guess quest designer, but that also applies to like open world or any other mission designers, level designers. The only difference I think is just that you get paid for it, and and you have a bigger budget to work with, and you can work with like actual professional 3D artists, for example, instead of like doing your own thing.
There's less limitations for sure.
Yeah, but still there's also one tricky part, and I think we shouldn't forget about that when you're a modder, you're kind of self-dependent, and then you jump into the 400 people project, and as you said before, you are kind of connecting tissue. And of course, we have 3 musketeers, but as a connecting tissue, you kind of, as Philip said, he communicated a request and discussed something with Przybyłowicz, who was the main composer for it, right? For the Witcher. And then you have some other people, VFX coming, SFX, gameplay and stuff. And you have to be great regarding communication, right? You know what I mean? Yeah. Because I'm not saying you demand from people, but you order things, and sometimes you tell them what you actually need, and you need to, but at the same time you are collabing with them. So it's not that you're demanding; you're kind of convincing also, that it's necessary.
Yeah.
And this is a skill.
I mean, convincing. I think it's actually easier than being convinced and being able to channel other people's opinions, right? Because I've had situations where it actually works both ways now that I think about it. Because I've had people, who are completely non-narrative that actually, I don't want to give examples, but they weren't working with the narrative, and they gave me, their own perspective on things during dialogue, and I realized, oh shit, I need to correct that, because they're actually better at it.
They have a point.
It feels like that at that point, and your initial reaction is to get defensive if you don't know that feeling, and you don't recognize it, because that basically undermines everything I know, right? Because they had a better idea than me. That's unthinkable, right? Yeah. But if you kind of recognize that feeling and you know how to channel it, you can actually make the thing that you're working on better. Mm-hmm. And actually, it works the other way around, because I did have also some victories. I still see it as a conflict. But I remember in Blood and Wine, Marcin Przybyłowicz gave me a specific piece of music for a specific sequence in the game. The part where you ride on the horse towards the castle. Now it's full in the new enhanced version. It's the full thing. Yeah. So the music, in my opinion, it completely ruined everything there. Because what I was imagining, picturing, and working towards in my head was something like more action oriented, but like action and suspense, and he went full suspense, right? And it's probably because I told him suspense and I didn't mention action, so he just gave me suspense, right? But then I said, no, that music can't go there, and I was like, oh my god, I'm transgressing my boundaries, because Marcin probably knows what he's doing, but I'm feeling it, right? So I shared it, and he told me to try it. I tried with the music that I thought was appropriate, and he said, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and this is awesome actually, and it's actually, in my opinion, all about Red. Like the great ideas wins always.
Yeah,
like
yeah. End of the day, the great idea kind of shines through.
Yeah.
But that's actually also one of the best moments when you work with a team where you manage to actually talk about all the things around your quest, what they're working on, what you're working on, that everyone gets excited about it. Where I'm actually super happy if people start adding ideas. I remember also Blood and Wine. I'd made that fairy tale land, and I had narrative QA Przemek Tarczynski, later became a quest designer for good reason. He just, he gave me feedback, but also in the end of the feedback was always, we have, priorities for bugs. P0, biggest priority. He gave me P5 bugs that were like, wouldn't it be nice if there was also, I think Rumchais, which is, the dwarf with the little hat. It's like, that would be nice. And then, we added those things. And I think
small
that's
suggestions.
Exactly. But I think that's really good if you actually, those ideas come together. And I think that's also really important that as a quest designer, you don't think you're the gray eminence that knows best. No, that idea is great. Sure, let's do it.
That's also something for me that I feel like is super difficult, because you're actually getting feedback from a lot of places, from higher ups, from people QAing the thing, from players that are playtesting that. There's a lot of things that kind of come together. It must be very difficult just to balance all these things. And it feels like a real challenge for sure.
Yeah, you absolutely have to prioritize. But also, at some point, especially when you become more experienced, you of course also have to be confident in your opinions. Yeah. So as an example, I used to be a quest designer. Now I'm a narrative director, so I sometimes give very specific feedback. And I think that is the way this should be done right now. So I give that feedback. We had a moment like this yesterday. I discussed with our quest designer, Maciej Duda. And I had a very specific opinion. No, this doesn't work. We should do it like this. But then he mentioned something else that was against what I said. I was like, well, I have my very strong opinion. I think that worked. But what he just said, I think that works a bit better. So even though I just had said, no, we should do it like this, that was genuinely a better idea. And it was doable. So like, here, you know what? I think that works. Yeah. And that is very important, that you never get into that mood of
cleverest person in the room, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Exactly.
You just
this
you
is the
know
way we do
better.
it, end the story, right?
Exactly.
And this is why we always make that comparison that the quest designer is a bit like a director. Where that issue that as a narrative director I have now officially, you do have that as a quest designer too, because everyone will have opinions for your work. And that's also one of these things, we say that as a bit of a joke, because writers have that same opinion. Everyone has opinions on story. Right? Because everyone can write stories. So you get a lot of opinions. And it's also your job not to be the guy who says, well, but I'm the quest designer, I'm the writer. It's my job to know better. Because sometimes you do, and it's important to not give in to just every feedback you get. But sometimes someone has a really good feedback, and then you need to be open to that. And that can come from anyone. That can come from your lead. Well, there you really need to listen. But that can come from VFX, that can come from QA, that can come from your cinematic designer, anyone. And in my personal opinion, I think I had moments when stuff like that literally came from almost any discipline in this company. And you do need to be open to that.
And I was working with leads and directors, because that's what I've been doing for now. Now I am lead, but that I've been working with leads for a long time, and still have plenty of people sort of above me in the structure. It's kind of hard to know when to stop arguing, right? Your point, because sometimes you want to push back on a decision, and there is room for that here, and that's great. But sometimes you also have to know when to stop. So the approach that I usually take right now is just to make sure except for things like I'm adamant about, and then you have to just force me to. but for the most part, the approach I take is like I present all the consequences, and I try to be fair to their decision, right? I try to be fair. It's hard to be fair because it's easy to misrepresent someone's opinion, so it feels less valid, right? But I try to present all the. I try to make sure that the decision that they're making is conscious and that they are aware of all the ramifications that they might not be aware of because of where they stand. Because usually, if the higher end the structure, the more broad your vision is, and when you're lower, you're lower. It's where like in the trenches, your understanding is much more. Not tactile, but like you have it very internalized.
Okay.
So you understand what's going to happen with the whole domino if you push this one brick, right? And I think that's the responsibility of a line developer to just let the leadership know that this is going to happen.
Yeah.
So
full context.
Are you sure you want to make this? And you want to make this call, and if they say yeah, then okay,
then we do it.
I've done my part. I've given all the consequences I can, and that's it, right? The other thing, going back to what you were saying about holding the vision, etc. What do you do? And I'm going to ask a question here because I want to hear your opinion. What do you do when the only thing that you have going at the very initial stages of the project is just, an idea, paper, you have to like verbalize it, tell it to someone, and they're not into it. But it's going to work. And like your only argument is just basically, trust me, bro, right? it's gonna work. And I've been there, right? And it's tough. Usually I just go with the thing that, my preferred medium to tell stuff is games, right? So obviously when I tell you this story, by just recounting it as a, speech or written text, it's probably going to hit worse, but I know it's going to work out as a game. Trust me, bro. So what do you do then?
I think for me, it's first of all important to actually figure out why they don't like it. Because often, let's say if your whole quest is, let's say, 10 parts, maybe there's that one part that there's so much against that it kind of makes all of those 9 other parts bad as well. So maybe they only have a problem really with one aspect of it. And maybe actually you can find a solution for this one. Because I actually had that many times where like, no, this does not work. This does not work. Okay. Let's talk about this. What specifically does not work here? Because maybe you find the key. And then that key suddenly opens up the whole thing. Because one thing I think is important, if someone says, and you give the full vision, this does not work, then that will also be a player, right? And then for some players, that does not work. And sometimes that can be a conscious choice, right? Like, I don't want to speak for him, but that as an example was a conscious choice. Patrick Mills did a quest in Cyberpunk with the Paralysis that consciously has an open ending.
Yes.
And we knew from the beginning there will be some people that will have a problem with that. But that is specifically the intent. So in that case, we're not fixing that problem. We're just making sure that that open ending is as compelling as it can be. Yeah. And then there is a
choice.
There is an opinion, but then it's a choice. And I think this is really important, that you know if there's a problem with it, it's an active choice. But usually I actually always try to find a solution.
Yeah, I agree. But actually, following this example is actually looking for the answer for why instead of what. Because if there is is the meaning behind this open ending, and you have like a definite, solid answer for it, for why you're doing it, is a strong yes to pursuing it. And the problem is that sometimes we tend to stop with what, because of something it doesn't work, but we are not dipping down the problem. You know what I mean? So like following the golden principles of design, and having the strong answers for why is always helpful. Yeah.
And actually, with the kind of games we're making, sometimes that can be a positive. As an example, in Blood and Wine, I had the quest with a Knights tournament where you have Guillaume, Vivienne, and there is an ending that kind of implies that the happy end where they come together might not be really that happy end. That maybe that guy that you're helping, the great knight, maybe he just doesn't really have the best intentions. Maybe he treats that woman more like an object.
Yeah.
And then we had people that genuinely said, well, but I wanted him to get I'm annoyed that he didn't get the woman because that's just how this thing should go.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing.
That's
It's
a
the
very
same
good
as, spoilers for a 10-year-old game. If you tell Triss and Yennefer that you love him, if you tell them both, that's going to blow up in your face.
Good.
And I remember my roommate at the time, he had that and he was really upset. And I was like, why are you upset? Well, I didn't expect to happen. Well, why? You told two women that you love them. You don't expect...
Because I was playing a game and I'm
Yeah,
important.
but that's the
Player
thing.
one.
Because then he went further and he said, well, I only meant it with Yennefer. I only told it to Triss because I didn't want her to leave. So you don't see a problem with telling someone you love him just because you don't want him to leave, but you don't really mean it.
Should have just told him to test that in real life. See how it goes, bro.
Exactly.
Just test it. Just
and
see.
then he was like,
Or don't.
yeah, but he was like, fair enough. And that's good. Sometimes it's actually good if people have a problem with something. If it's interesting, if it's emotional.
Yeah.
If there's just a genuine problem, we also have to make sure you are there for it.
Because, being angry at something is also an emotion. And what we're trying to do is, that's the whole point of telling stories, right? Well, not the whole point. There's other things. Maybe you learn something from them. Maybe you understand something about yourself better. I don't know.
Even if you learn something, there is an emotion behind this.
Yeah, because it's a transformative process, right? But I think at the core of all of this is emotions. That's why we tell ourselves stories, right? And, we've done with Tomek Marchewka, we've done The Bank in Beauclair.
Nice. The heist.
Not the heist. It's the heist is Danish's Quest in Hearts of Stone.
Asterix. He mentioned.
And actually, the reference to Asterix and Obelix, that came later. We just wanted to tap into frustration.
Yeah.
Because we thought, okay, we've never done this. And actually, I remember reading an article online about exploring this space. I think it's taken down now, and I can't link you to it anymore. But it was something I read online, and I thought, yes, someone's getting it.
Someone understands.
But it's it's like with people for Cyberpunk, like they would like to have a good ending. Some of them, I guess. But the best we can give is bittersweet.
Yeah.
And that's not because, we're trying to do it, we're trying to be edgy or whatever. No. It's because it fits, like the whole discussion we had about at the beginning of this, about it fits the world, it fits the story, it fits the themes that we're touching on. And it just, a happy ending would just ruin that, undermine all of it. Because then there's an obvious good choice, right? And then you're not conflicted anymore, and the whole world comes apart. And if you a happy end would ruin the game immediately.
Yeah,
I agree.
Well, and that's also just a big conscious choice we make for our quest generally, that we don't want to do wish fulfillment. We don't want to do the game where you get everything as a player, and everyone loves you, and everyone makes you presents, and romance type. Everyone wants to have sex with you and everyone loves you. Yeah. No, if we do as an example a romance, they should also be a bit challenging sometimes. You're actually dealing with a character. And that's the interesting thing about it. And these are conscious choices that we do. Or this rule that everything in a video game has to be fun. No, we have, I'm not going to go into details, but we have a funeral quest in the game. Mm-hmm. That quest isn't fun. Yeah. There's nothing fun about this quest, but it's compelling. Yes. And that's the important thing. Everything needs to be compelling, but not everything needs to be fun. Not everything needs to give you what you want, as long as it actually is compelling. And that's also one of those big things where some people will always disagree with that. There are people who say video games should always be fun. If I play for 5 minutes, I should have fun. And I think that's valid. And that's why a lot of games are like that.
I don't feel like they stay with you. Like our games stay. Like some stories that we tell, I feel like they are like braced into our souls. Are like quests that you finish.
You can relate to them.
You leave the pad and you go out for a walk and you digest it for 20, 30 minutes just to kind of understand like what the hell just happened. Like could I have done something different? Could I maybe, could have gone in any other way? No. And then, but why? Was this a conscious choice? Why did they do that? It's like, I sometimes feel like you you just pretty much mess with my brain, and I'm like, what should I feel now?
Sometimes you're not in the mood for that. And I think that's perfectly fine. There's other games out there. And, myself, I play sometimes games, I don't know, I play League of Legends because I want to talk to my friend over a game, right? That's fine.
Yeah,
right?
I play card games for that reason.
Yeah.
Because you get an easy outcome pretty much. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So this is the kind of experience that we are sort of making, right? And, it's a thing that you engage with if you feel like it.
Yeah. But also just as the most general rule, that's also why we're not making a game where we're, having 1,000 people give us grades and everyone needs to give 10 out of 10. No, we're making a game that we think will be great for us. Right? Because that's also one thing. I'm making the kind of game I want to play, and there will be some people that don't want to play that game.
Yeah.
And that's fine, as long as, of course, enough people want to play that game, because our games are very expensive. So you have to keep that in mind.
Yeah.
But if you start trying to make a game that really is for everyone, it's going to be for no one.
It's gonna be even.
Yeah.
Guys, you said about Asterix, you said about Rune Size in the fairy tale world. That's a really cool source of inspirations.
Yeah.
But that's the question, what inspires you, everyday work? How did you, where did you find the inspiration?
Yeah, especially when it comes to quests. What inspires you? Apart from, of course, playing different games.
A steady and balanced media diet. That's but also for real, you have to really engage with what other people are doing, and you have to analyze it. You have to watch it consciously, sometimes rewatch it. You also have your there's this exercise that you can do as a creator, so to speak, where you list, let's say, 7-10 pieces of media. It can be anything, like a book, a movie, whatever, that really resonate with you. Not something that you like, but something that stays with you, right? So for me, for example, it would be The Exorcist, Alien, that kind of stuff. I have this list, right? And then you analyze what kinds of themes are there, what kinds of characters are there, right?
So you're dissecting the whole thing pretty much.
Yes, you can literally, it's a very easy process. You can just sit down and it's almost like listing down the things that kind of resonate with you, and then, okay, how does that work in the other thing, right? So if this is what works for me in The Exorcist, then let's see how that works in Aliens, for example, or I don't know, Forrest Gump, or Fallout 2, whatever, right? What types of characters, genres, moods, vibes, feels, whatever, emotions, all that stuff, and you'll start finding shared things. So, for example, and even in things that seem very far away from each other. So, I don't know, you take the Russell Crowe movie about the tobacco industry, Insider, right? And then Forrest Gump, right? The character is a person who's way above their head, but they're trying to challenge, they're trying to solve the problems that they face in their life. Anyhow, even though their problems are vastly overwhelming. So you can find those things. And the cool part is that when you do this exercise, you consciously understand what is that's important to you, and that's how you find your voice, right? As a creator. So I invite everyone to do this exercise. I know Tomek's done it as well. When I told him I find out about this, he says, "Yeah, I did it a couple of years ago." So
nice.
Yeah, but I think it's also interesting that there can be so many approaches to this. Because as an example, I do it, or I used to do it differently. Of course, if you're, let's say, in management, lead director, you have to do it in a more structured way. But when I was a quest designer, my approach was literally, I think we call it goulash, where I do not actually plan these things out. I just start in front of a blank page, and I just have a huge amount of things in the back of my head, and I just go and I see what happens. And sometimes that can really work. But as Błażej actually said, you need to put in the work beforehand.
Yeah.
So as an example, I joined the company to make The Witcher Wild Hunt. I was a big Witcher fan. I read the Witcher books. I read tons of stuff about medieval history. I read tons of stuff about, medieval German fairy tales. So lots of these things. I could come up with 50 Witcher quests in a day and just full on Witcher. But then we did Cyberpunk, and I was like, well,
This is
I have seen The Matrix, and once I've seen Ghost in the Shell, and I played Deus Ex when I was 12. And I know, we have discussions. Yes, I know. And
Never mind.
but basically, oh no, how will I tell cyberpunk stories? But then we really put in the work. And as an example, we had a reading list. I know Marcin Blacha added to that. Patrick Mills did a lot for this.
Yeah.
And I just started at the beginning. I started reading proto-cyberpunk novels that are science fiction, like The Star Is My Destination,
Nice.
the Sprawl trilogy. I think I read more than 20 books. I watched all the movies. So basically, you need to put in all that work so you can do the goulash again. So I can just sit down in front of a blank page, and then I have all of those disconnected things swirling around. I get a bit of a feeling that just to rephrase, because I don't want to copy stuff.
Yes.
So you need to just have a huge, I would say, quantity as well.
To draw
So you
inspiration
don't you don't draw direct inspirations from, but you draw, as an example, inspiration from certain themes that you've seen in multiple stories, or certain ways a character was written, but you do something completely different. And this you can only do if you actually put in the work and
made the
that
homework.
genre in and out. So if you want to know how that can look like in the extreme, I encourage anyone to Google Andrzej Sapkowski fantasy reading list.
Oh yeah.
Like the
yeah.
list that Andrzej Sapkowski considers.
The anthology from the cave.
Yeah, like if you want to know fantasy, you need to read those books,
Yeah.
and it's a big list.
When he was here in the studio, something that he mentioned, he said openly that for him it was pulling inspiration from different things, and sometimes he didn't know how to do things, so he would read up on those things in order to, especially when it came to combat and stuff like that, he would read about that just to have it more realistic and to have it in his, balanced diet or goulash for you. I feel like we're
Why
both
are we
kind of
working with food
it's food,
analogies?
right? Yeah, but it makes sense, right? You have a little bit of vegetables, a little bit of protein, a little bit of this, and you kind of put it together.
Calls it cocktail.
Yeah, or a cocktail
You
for
can
him.
call it
Yeah,
goulash,
yeah,
cocktail. He
yeah,
calls it
cocktail. Yeah.
Yeah, and I love the way how the book starts. Actually, it's like if you call yourself that you know what the fantasy is, and you didn't read those 50 books, don't call yourself this.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah.
Respect,
Yeah.
but
But
always bold.
But I think there's also life experience, and just detaching yourself from media also works, and just doing weird things, acquiring new skills, putting yourself, like, I don't know, when I went to the gym, which is to you it's you're like second nature, but to me it's a weird place with weird people. and I went there and put myself in this weird out of my comfort zone spot. Now it's different, but it does kind of tell you, like, if you think about it and analyze the emotions you're going through and the discomfort and all that stuff, that sort of also gives you some information, because it's really hard. I mean, you can theoretically have very poor or limited life experience. I used to be a bartender. I used to work on constructions. You were a firefighter, right?
Freelance.
Nice.
Yes. So I think there's value to that as well.
Absolutely.
Because
How to make the funeral a thing? You know what I mean? Like a really meaningful content.
How to make it real.
Like exactly.
But I think that's also one of the most important things, to just have life and these experiences, so you actually, at least, you can say something. Because you can know all of these things from pop culture. I can watch all the movies that are in the cinema, but then I can regurgitate those things, and maybe I can do a story. But does that really say something of my own? I actually need to go through some things, and
Add
I
more
think
personality to it.
exactly. And I think as an artist, you need to be able to maybe go to these places, because that's also one important thing that I think we haven't even mentioned about that. One important thing about a good quest is also, and not every quest, some are just fun, but let's say one of the deeper, best quests is there's also like an artistic need to really do something, to say something, to make people think, to make people feel. And I think for that, you do need to, go to a deeper well. And I think that is really, really important too. Because a lot of the best stories that I think we have in our company, they're often coming from a personal place of maybe the quest designer, of the writer, or different people. And sometimes they also come back to classic literature. A lot of our best stories, I mean, if we look at Hearts of Stone, if you know Pan Twardowski, if you know Faust, that is the inspiration there, right? Where we actually also want to go a little bit deeper. So I think that's also really important, that we need to be, to a certain extent, well-read. We need to not just know pop culture, we also need to know culture.
Exactly.
And actually, that's harder to pick up than the technical stuff. Because it takes a long time, unless you're like power leveling, like Philip was describing, his power leveling for Cyberpunk. For me, it was thankfully easier because I used to be into Cyberpunk, back in high school days.
Nice.
So I had some kind of basis, but also I needed to do some of this work. And it just helps, and it takes a long time to get these. How I think we can call them cultural competences, right?
Wow.
Yeah.
Well said.
It takes a long time, and picking up the engine is actually the easy part. It's funny because when you hire someone new, on a junior position, they're stressing out about the engine and the tech so much that they often forget the actual important part, which is the foundation.
The foundation.
Tech is just a way to get there, right?
Well, that's actually also one of the rules we had when hiring Quest designers, where if someone's really strong in design but not that good in tech, that's fine. The tech part we can teach.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
The other way around is much
That's what I
harder.
wanted to say. Like it's much harder to actually, have the foundation of building something, and instead of then just the tools. The tools are things that you can pick up and learn, and then just hone kind of your skill.
And actually, it's the rule that you can. It works in every discipline, to be honest. Same with animation, cinematic design.
It's like knowing a language but having nothing to say.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And that's also, I think, that requirement then also comes with the ability to go deeper in research. So as an example, when you do your Cyberpunk deep dive, at some point, you may also recognize that, so where do those tropes from Cyberpunk come from? Maybe now I also need to consider noir elements as an example. And then that, I think, comes where you go then a little bit deeper, you start digging. So you become able not just to copy, but to also create in that genre. And I think that part, that gets tricky. And as an example, when we started Cyberpunk, we took a really long time to get in there. We read a lot.
Find our voice.
Yeah, we watched a lot. We discussed. We played some video games that we discussed because we needed that time as well. A lot of us had done fantasy for a long time, and we needed to.
It's hard to transition.
Get in there. Yeah. It was really good to have some people in our team like Patrick who were like very adamant, like, you guys need to know this. This is important. So there was no other chance. There was no other choice. We had to become experts.
He is a lore master for a reason.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I think because I feel like we could go on for days. I think this is a place where we should kind of put a pin in it so we don't go into 2-hour territory. But it was amazing to talk to you guys. Very insightful. And I feel quests are, I think, something that we all kind of think we can do in some sense, but it's much difficult than we kind of think about it.
It's super complex.
Yeah, it's super complex.
I mean, it's also, I think, sometimes it comes easy.
We don't have the proper perspective to say that.
Yeah.
I don't think after so many years.
Because I think it's also one of these things where we make it sound like all of these deep things and so complicated. But sometimes, we also have quest designers that start and they just kind of hit it out of the park. It's also a really fun job, right? We don't want to act like you need to become the expert in all of these things. That's, of course, you sometimes need to put in that work, but also sometimes it's a pretty cool job. It's nice.
It's
I
very
love it.
impactful too.
Yeah.
Like it's one of the things that is very impactful. Like we know here at CDPR that story is important, and quests and story, they work perfectly together. And this is what the player experiences. This is what they interact with, and this is the emotional baggage that we have after experiencing a game. So yeah, it's incredible.
Yeah, this is it. Guys, thanks a lot for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks
for having us.
Thank you. Always a pleasure, man.
Oh, it was a pleasure.
Cool.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot for tuning in into this Answered podcast dedicated to the Quest. We have way more to come. We're going to cover whole development process here at Red. So stay tuned.
There'll be more coming, but in the meantime, don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. We want to hear your feedback. We want to know if you're liking this content, and we want to get more information for you so we can make the next episodes even better. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next one.